I'm Chris Maloney. In my time, I've been a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist in Oxford and Berkshire in the NHS, and then I was a GP partner in Hackney. In the Hackney General Practice, we had a lot of people seeking asylum registered with us, and I started getting to know them and writing reports in some of their claims. And then I went on to develop an expert witness practice as a psychiatrist and as a GP doing asylum work. And I did this for about 20 years.
So I'm Alison. I'm also a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, and at the moment I work with refugees in two contexts. I write medical reports for people seeking asylum for a tiny organisation called Torture ID, where Chris and I are also both board members. And the second thing I'm involved in at the moment is a tiny community group where I live locally for people seeking asylum and refugees. And in the past, I've worked with refugees in various contexts. I've been the volunteer psychotherapist for many years with Freedom from Torture, worked with an NHS trust trying to develop strategies to support staff working with refugees and so on.
And I'm Nelki, and I'm a retired child and family psychiatrist, and I worked with refugee families and refugees over many years, both in the NHS and in the voluntary sector.
And over lockdown, Julia and Alison and I produced this book, Seeking Asylum and Mental Health, a practical guide for professionals. And of course, this is the theme for today's seminar. And we're going to talk about some of the things we've discussed in the book, and we're going to commend the book to you. When you're trying to help people with mental health issues, I think we all recognise that it's the basics that need attention first. And if you overlook these, then even the cleverest, most sophisticated or best evidenced intervention will get you nowhere. And because of this, I'm going to start our discussion with some very basic observations. Also, throughout this session, I want us to think about mental health rather than mental illness. Often mental health is used as a synonym for mental illness, but actually, I think we should remember it's about health. So, who are we going to talk about today? Not everyone claiming asylum may have good grounds for protection under international law. Members of our government have repeatedly said that the majority of those who are currently arriving in small boats are economic migrants, rather than people who've got good grounds for protection, who've fled danger and who've suffered. So we need to note this, but also that we're not really sure about what the evidence is for this. And even some of the politicians who've made this claim have subsequently backtracked on it. And the daily experience of those of us who work with people seeking asylum does seem rather different. Be this as it may, our focus today is going to be on the situation of those people who are eligible for international protection by virtue of the experiences that they've had, but haven't yet had this recognised, and so are still in the position of seeking asylum rather than having refugee status. The task of establishing the truth of people's accounts for themselves and determining their actual right to asylum is a very different one from supporting those who've suffered serious adversity and who are seeking help. Yet the two can't, although different, they can't be easily separated, because the asylum system and all that follows from it does have a profound effect on people's mental health. And the way the system works, unless largely you're from Ukraine, is that everybody is routinely challenged and disbelieved as an inherent part of asking for help. So it's always worth reiterating that a refugee is someone who's had it accepted that they can't go back to the country that they fled, that they need safety and protection and a chance to build a life somewhere else, at least for the time being, and they can set about this building. However, if you're an asylum seeker, your needs haven't yet been recognised, and they may never be. You live with minimal resources on the margins of a strange society, subject to hostile scrutiny, both by others in the community in which you're living and also from the official process itself. And of course, you may be removed from the country at any time. The question for governments and for society is whether we have an asylum system that focuses on the legitimate needs of the vulnerable, or one that focuses on the deterrence and the discomforting of those we think are trying to take advantage of us, and indeed whether it's a binary choice. And you all, of course, know which direction 21st century Britain has taken and what's being debated in the Lords this afternoon. But what can we say then about the people who are seeking asylum, who've got a claim, which we think are quite a lot of them? They each have their own unique life story, but they all arrive with dislocation, multiple losses, and uncertainty about the future income. Almost all will have experienced or witnessed violence. Some will have been imprisoned, interrogated, or suffered sexual violence, and some will have been tortured. All have lost their homes, social networks, and social status. Some may well have had positive, affirming experiences along the way too, and this is important. Acts of kindness, new intimacy, discovering unexpected strengths, or being able to help others. Their challenge has been to find a way to carry on living and perhaps to grow and develop as a result, rather than to be overwhelmed and disabled by their experience. And simply having reached the United Kingdom has been, for most, the result of many determined acts of survival. Others, less lucky or with fewer resources, will not have made it. And sometimes advocates for those who seek asylum portray them as vulnerable, traumatized victims in need of services and support. This is, of course, part of the truth, but it's not all of it. There's a risk that people can only be thought of as needing help if they're depicted as victims, not if they show signs of strength and independence, and perhaps the very strength and independence that's enabled to reach the UK in the first place. What people then have to do is find some way to emotionally, cognitively, and physically process all the experiences that they've had and find a way forward to rebuild themselves and their lives. This may not be easy, but it's very necessary. Now, the process of grief is widely recognised and understood nowadays. It's recognised that it's integral to coping with the loss of those close to us. And importantly, everybody knows that grief isn't about being sick, ill, or damaged. It's a healthy reaction to loss, and it's a process with a purpose. It's not a static set of symptoms. It's not a syndrome. It's got well-recognised components, but these affect each person in their own way and at their own speed. As yet, there is no such well-recognised and accepted analogous model for the psychic integration of the sort of life-changing adversity that's affected people who seek asylum. This is exemplified by the fact that there's no well-recognised name for such a process. There are various trauma narratives, and PTSD being a prime example, but these centre on ideas of being ill and damaged that aren't necessarily appropriate. However, personal growth following adversity is well recognised, both anecdotally and academically. The term post-traumatic growth is used for the positive psychological change experienced following adversity and profound challenges, when an individual's adaptability, personal resources and ways of understanding the world and their place in it are put to the test. There can be life-changing shifts in thinking and relating to the world and the person's sense of self and the way they attribute meaning. This idea goes some way towards the recognition of a process akin to grief, but it's only partially, because it emphasizes growth rather than the mourning and acceptance and distress that are also part of it. It's an important idea, however, that it emphasizes that doing well after adversity is more than a simple issue of showing resilience, which is often thought of as the ability to survive and maintain the status quo. It's the ability to not be affected by what's happened to you. I know it can be more sophisticated than that, but that's often how it's heard. And Renos Papadopoulos has additionally coined the term adversity-activated development, which emphasizes that personal growth might be as a direct result of the adversity of itself, rather than post-traumatic. It doesn't even require you to have been wounded in some way. People may discover reserves of courage or altruism or all sorts of things that just happen directly. So there's all these things going on. But the question really about this process is, what helps people do well? If we can rely on a healing process, and using healing in a physiological rather than a quasi-mystical sense, a healing process of some sort coming into play, what are the conditions that help this process go well? And this is the key to what we're going to go on and think about today. What are the factors that help people grow and develop following adversity? Now, there's a lot in this slide, but we've got time to look at it. It's a list of the things that help and empower people in recovering from the sort of experiences we've been talking about. It uses a model devised by an Australian psychiatrist called Derek Sylove, which he calls ADAPT, which are the the important areas listed down this side. These examples from personal accounts are based on conversations that we've had with individuals in clinical settings in the UK, identifying themes that are well substantiated by the available literature. These are the things that you need if you're assured of these and assured of these things in multiple ways, then you may be able to get on and recover. I'll give you a few moments to digest the slide. There's a lot about how you interact with people, how you're valued, what control you have over your life, whether you're believed and validated, what you can think about for the future, what your frameworks of meaning are. These are not sort of soft, nice, optional things. These are the very crucial relational aspects of an environment that will help you do well and help you recover. I'll finish with one last observation. If you wanted to ensure that people who had faced major problems, major disruption and trauma in their lives, if you wanted to ensure that they did badly and developed illness rather than going through a healthy process, you could use this list and you could use it to design something to frustrate or negate every one of these things, every one of these qualities that people find helpful. And if you did this, you'd probably design something that looks very much like the UK asylum system today.
The overall case is fictional one. Okay. So Yusuf is a young man from Ethiopia. And while he was still at school, he took part in a political demonstration, got arrested. He was held in a police station, was badly beaten up, had sexual threats made to him, and was told that if he didn't agree to act as a police informer, he'd be arrested again and worse would happen. During his journey to the UK, he spent 10 days adrift in a boat in the Mediterranean and was convinced he was going to die. Another big part of his journey was several months in Calais, and then he had another boat journey to the UK. When he arrived, he was still 17, so was looked after by social services. He says that from the time he was in the police station, he's felt constantly frightened. He really struggles to sleep. He's troubled by nightmares and flashbacks. Nevertheless, when he first got here and he had the routine assessment with a paediatrician, the paediatrician's record says that he had no mental health symptoms and had no recent trauma, bizarrely. What Yusuf said to me was when he got to the UK, he felt a little bit better. He felt safe. He started to feel hopeful about having a future. And some of his symptoms were less prominent, and he thought it was the right thing to try and put what had happened behind him, to think about the future, not think about what he'd gone through, certainly not talk about it. Fast forward a few years and Yusuf received negative decisions from the Home Office and then from a tribunal. At that point, his mental health, which was already pretty bad, got a lot worse. He got really depressed. He started to hear a voice telling him to kill himself. He did cut his arm several times in response to that. He started to get other psychotic symptoms, which are not recorded in the notes. But the crisis team he saw at that time did write that they thought he was cutting himself for attention. I saw Yusuf when his lawyer had referred him for a specialist medical report about his psychological and physical scars. And at that point, he seemed really pretty unwell to me. But what he told me was he was actually feeling a bit better because having a new lawyer who seemed to be a lot more active on his case and it was enabling him to submit a fresh claim had given him new hope. And he'd also made contact with somebody he'd known in Calais. But Chris and Julia and I embarked on this book because we felt that there's potential for people like Yusuf to have fewer difficulties with their mental health. We think that it's possible for people to be helped more effectively, and that's possible even in services where people feel under pressure and have very few resources. I'm going to talk now a little bit about what can be done by people whose role is outside mental health services, because that's what we understand our audience is today. It's really difficult when we don't know quite who you are and can't even see you, but that's what we're thinking. So we tried to think about some key messages and came up with 10. It's quite a convenient number. We think it's helpful to think about these key messages in terms of things that apply to before you meet with somebody who's struggling with their mental health, what you can do beforehand, what you can do while you're with them, and also what you need to do after. So starting with before, I think that preparation is really important. So the first thing that we think is important is about being aware of the issues. And I guess everybody who's here today is trying to be aware of the issues, but the issues that affect people seeking safety, particularly the problems, the stresses they face are likely to be extreme. They might be things that are hard to imagine, and they're very likely to be multiple, and they will come on top of all the stresses that affect people new to this country and to the culture and to the language, people who have been through horrible things, are separated from the people that they care about, who are dealing with poverty and racism and so on. So over and above all that, the things that happen over and above all that, and thinking both about emotional stresses and also about physical stresses as well. So the second and third messages about preparation are about factual knowledge. I think it's important to have some basic knowledge about local options that are there for people where you work. So what refugee support is there, what services, what support groups, and if you've got lucky enough to have more than one, which ones do people find helpful? I think it's important to be aware of what NHS mental health services are available to people, as well as the GP. Most areas, I think there will be some kind of psychological therapy service, an IAT service that people can self-refer to. Some areas will be lucky enough to have access to some specialist mental health services for people seeking asylum. For example, they might have access to refugee council service or to freedom from torture, perhaps. And in some places there will be the possibility of self-referring for some kind of social prescribing. For example, it might be possible to get people access to free gym passes or to help finding voluntary work. The third message is about it's important to be aware of people's entitlements to free NHS care. And I think there's been a seminar in this series about this, so I'm not going to say anymore, except that there's one thing that people are often really unaware of. And while we've been online, I've actually had a message pop up on my screen from somebody who's a refugee who's been to a hospital appointment today, and I asked her, did you get your travel cost reimbursed? And she said, no, I didn't know about that. And I think that is really common, and I think it's really common amongst healthcare providers. So I think it's important anybody's advising people to be clear that people can get those travel costs reimbursed. The details about free NHS entitlements and about free healthcare costs for people on low income, the details are quite complicated, so I think the key thing is about knowing where to find the information and knowing the basics. Okay. So the fourth area about preparation, Julie is going to talk, is about having our own resources to enable us to be helpful, but Julie will say more about that. So I'm going to move on now to think about what are the key messages about what needs to happen when you're in contact with somebody who may be struggling with their mental health. So if your role is not part of mental health services, the first thing that is important to think about is making it possible for mental health to be spoken about. So creating opportunities for a conversation. It's not advice to probe people about what horrible things may have happened to them or what current symptoms they've got, but just about asking how people are coping and showing that you're aware that not having secure immigration status, not knowing what's going to happen to you, is a hugely stressful situation. So the next key message about what's helpful when you're with somebody is about listening, about really listening to what they're telling you about what they think would help. So going back to Yusuf, I think until recently, if he'd been asked what he thought would be the most helpful thing for him I think he would have said, help to find a new solicitor. And I think that's a really important point, because for many people, sorting out their asylum issues can be what is the crucial step to feeling better. And so if you're encountering somebody struggling with their mental health, it's worth saying to them, encouraging them to make sure their GP knows, but also to make sure their solicitor knows, assuming they have one, which obviously is an issue for many people at the moment. But it might be helping them find a solicitor as well. Okay, message number 7. I think it's really crucial that people know how to get help in future. Everybody has is likely to come across issues where they need support. And I think not everybody wants to go to a community group every week, but I think it's important that everybody knows how and where to get help if they need it. So for Yusuf, he was definitely not interested in going along to meet strangers in a strange environment, but he did have some input from his leaving care support worker, and it was that support worker who helped him find the new solicitor, which is what made the biggest difference to him, I think. So point 7, making sure people have some kind of group or service that they're either in contact with or know how to get into contact with. Then message number 8 is perhaps out of all our 10 messages, the one we would like to say is the important message. And this is about trying to make that encounter which you have with a person, even if it's short, even if it's the one of trying to make that meaningful, especially by thinking about some of the things that Chris is raising. Going back to Chris's table about the things that help, this is a kind of sister table which shows interventions to relate to the areas that help people do well following adversity. And the 5th area around identities and roles, interacting in ways that show respect, empathy and interest. So the way we are with people, being genuine, being really genuinely interested, being curious, being respectful, not promising things we can't do, listening properly, if it's going to be perhaps the last meeting, saying goodbye properly. And for people who have really little control over their life, if there is a genuine choice that you can offer, that in itself may be a small good experience. Okay, so go back to Yusuf again. I think all those things I've just mentioned are things that I guess we all hope that we're doing all the time. But it can be really hard when we're under pressure, and it can be really hard when people don't behave quite as we hope. And I think that has maybe been something which for Yusuf got in the way of him getting good help. When I first met with him in the first part of our meeting, he came across as rather laid back, a little bit disinterested, a little bit irritable. And I think that kind of cool and bravado is quite a common thing amongst young men who arrive here seeking safety. And I think it might work really well as a coping strategy in many situations, but what it doesn't do is really help people notice your vulnerable side or maybe feel enthusiastic about offering you help. Okay, so moving on to thinking about 2 things that are relevant after meeting somebody. First thing is about keeping good records of what happened. And good records are important in this context, particularly because they can end up as part of somebody's asylum case bundle that turns up in the tribunal, in the Home Office lawyer. So for Yusuf, it may not have been helpful that paediatrician announced he had no mental health problems, or that the crisis team suggested he was feigning needs. The kind of things that are useful are to be really factual, to write down about what you've observed and maybe about other objective evidence. For example, Yusuf was only going to college, his attendance to fall into 50%, or that his housemates noticed he barely came off after his room, or you noticed that he wasn't making eye contact or was answering in monosyllables, those kind of things. And a very last point is about following through, so that if you have tried to help somebody make contact with a community group, or suggested that they see their GP, then doing something to try and make sure it happens. It might be that the person's fine doing it themselves, but a call to check that they've been able to might be a really important thing, or maybe taking steps to make it easier for them. I think it's really striking how often things don't get followed through. And in Yusuf's situation, but as part of my task of writing a report for him, I went through his GP records and noticed that he'd been prescribed antidepressants at least 4 times, but has never taken them for more than a month. And most of you will probably know that that means that if they were going to help, they had little chance of showing that they could do. He'd also been twice referred to counselling, but each time to an opt-in service, and unsurprisingly, he didn't manage to opt in. There are lots of good reasons why people don't follow through, but I think it's really incumbent on us trying to help to be aware of those and try and help with that. So for somebody who's a lay person, not in the health service, but may have a much more important contribution to make by just that phone call that helps something happen, that may be more important than all the skills of the psychotherapist or the doctor who never gets seen or never gets their treatment followed up. And I'm going to stop there and hand over to you, Julia. Okay.
Yeah, just one point I was going to make while you go off the slide share was that how important it can be to help people get to the community groups. You might know that there's one, but people will not want to go, and it'll be really important to try and you have to do quite a lot to help them get there.
Yeah, that's what I was meaning by following through. Exactly. I think that's really important. I agree. Yeah. Okay,
so I'm going to talk a bit about working. How do you keep going as somebody who's working with people seeking asylum? How do you keep going with this kind of work? And I thought I'd just say something about the work that I've done. So it was in 1999 I began working in the NHS with refugee and asylum seeking families as a child psychiatrist, and I developed a new service that gave families the use of an allotment, a garden, alongside individual, family and group work, a community approach that brought local families together with asylum seeking ones, so that they could help understand each other better. And although the stories were disturbing, there was so much to learn about other cultures and conflicts, working with interpreters, human rights, racism, injustice, acts of solidarity, and what enables people to keep hope alive in the face of inhumanity. And I did all kinds of things that hadn't been possible in my work before, that led to improved services for all the families attending CAMS, and that in itself was a kind of way of encouraging me to keep going. And the hardest part was seeing the injustice and the apparently arbitrary decisions of the Home Office that at times destroyed people's lives, but also their lack of action, particularly as we see now, the agonising wait that many have to go through before their asylum decision is made. So that this work changed me. And I thought I'd briefly mention some of the effects this kind of work can have on us, and also what can sustain us. So when you're in any kind of new and unfamiliar work, there might be different responses that you have that you're not used to. So you might find yourself mirroring the behaviour or actions of the person you're with, or feeling something very strongly that you haven't felt before. So sometimes the refugee or a person seeking asylum may talk about his or her experience in a very detached way, but you end up feeling really angry and upset at the end of the session, and sometimes you can be picking up something of their feelings that they've not been able to express, and that can be quite disturbing. Not that these are things to note, to be aware of, not necessarily to do anything about. I mean, well, not at the time with somebody. How do I move this forward? The other thing that's possible, you might feel suddenly overwhelmed by something of someone's story that resonates with something or someone in your own life, and those resonances again can take you unawares, and also be something to kind of note and become aware of, not to push away or talk about with a client, but to reflect on later. Pain and hopelessness. It's very hard not to feel this when working with people in such difficult situations. And often the most important thing, as Alison and Chris have said, can be to listen, even if it is really painful and there's nothing you can do to change their situation. The listening, people always tell us, makes such a difference, being properly heard. And it can be so hard just to listen. So power and powerlessness. Clients usually feel in a very powerless situation and having lost everything, and they want the people working with them to be powerful, able to make a difference, even if they can't. And that can be a difficult thing to hold on to, as can the differences in privilege. So our situation as compared to theirs, and that can feel quite uncomfortable. Again, one of those things to be aware of and hold on to, not to ignore, but it can make us feel guilty, and it can affect how they see us. Also, it's important to be aware of our own limits in giving knowledge or time, and that can be hard. We might really want to make to help people, but then realize our own limits. We don't have endless time. We don't want to invite people into our house, or and the neediness of people seeking asylum is often very great, and we won't be able to solve their main problem, which is that they want asylum. So we have to recognize and live within our own limits. But flexibility and not sticking rigidly to boundaries is also very important in this work. Working in the garden with families, as I did, it was important to kind of know what, that there were boundaries you needed to keep as you would in your clinical practice, but also to be able to cross them to some extent to enable people to come. So if you had to go and pick someone up and bring them to the garden, you might have to do, things you wouldn't do in our normal clinical practice anyway. And this work can be isolating as a worker. Depends what team you're in or who you're working with, but it can feel quite isolating if others in your team or organization don't agree with what you're doing, or with people seeking asylum being here at all, and that can be quite hard. But there also are rewards, as I've said, and I'll come back to. So some effects on practitioners: oversimplification. I mean, that we have a chapter by Renas Papadopoulos on that, really, that complex needs can sometimes be perceived as simpler than they are, in order to make the work more straightforward. Like seeing a person as having PTSD and needing specialized trauma therapy, so refer them on, rather than thinking about other help in the here and now that you may be able to offer, and that may actually make more of a difference, like taking them to a community group. Overcommitment or undercommitment. Some people can find this work all-consuming, want to rescue people, work longer hours, have difficulty switching off, and others might do the opposite and just become very detached. Important to think about what's happening, what you're doing. And each of those positions is an attempt to protect us from the discomfort of being aware of the great needs that we cannot address. But there are some needs we can address. So sometimes, finding the work overwhelming and finding it hard to leave stories behind can leave people not being able to workers not being able to sleep, or even having flashbacks, and they may not be able to continue, be totally physically and mentally exhausted. And this is obviously really, really difficult. Different names are given to this, such as vicarious traumatization or burnout. But it's worth looking more closely at these responses in a bit more detail and what they may relate to. So I thought I'd mention the term moral injury, which refers to working within a setting where what you are able to offer or what you have to do goes against your values and beliefs and leaves you feeling drained and guilty. Although difficult, this way of looking at it shifts the focus from an individual feeling inadequate or unable to cope to seeing it as a problem of the system you're working in, which can be important to help to recognize it and then find ways to tackle it. Yeah, and the adversity activated development, I think, can also be something a therapist or a worker feels, that you learn things about yourself, as I did when I did this kind of work, that you didn't know before, that it helps you develop, and that can be important in keeping going. So what helps clinicians do well? I mean, the main thing really, I think we want to say is to be able to reflect on what's happened, on what conversations you've had with someone, how you felt about it, noticing your physical and emotional responses, and creating a reflective space. And that's very, very difficult, I think, for many of us to do. And often the systems we're in don't encourage that either. So it can be, it's really important to see how valuable that is and what a difference it can make. So talking with others, other colleagues, might be a regular supervision group with a supervisor, it might be a peer mentoring scheme. There are lots of different ways of doing it, but I think that, we have found that is absolutely crucial. And this can change the way you see the work and yourself within it. And I want to mention one way of doing this in particular. What happens if you think of yourself as a bringer of hope and a witness to their story and situation? And I find Kate Weingarten's witness grid very helpful in this. And she talks about two dimensions, one of empowerment and the other of awareness. And a person is likely to feel competent and effective in position one, aware and empowered, but that's a very difficult position to be in. Although no one can be in it all the time. It's a position to aim for. In this kind of work that we are involved in, and I think most of you are involved in, we're often in position 4, aware of what's needed, but feeling disempowered to do anything, not knowing what we can do to make a difference. Position 2 may be the most dangerous one, where people do not understand what they're witnessing, but nonetheless respond as if they know what they're doing and are in positions of power. Maybe those who see all asylum seekers as criminals and treat them badly in a way, it's a kind of easier position to take because you've just decided that they're not, that you don't have to do anything. And sorry if I said this right. Yeah, so that's position 2. In position 3, a person cannot register what is truly happening and therefore takes no action to make things better and therefore makes things worse. The bystander position. Position 4 may be the most common. In this position, a person's, as I said, aware of what's going on, but is either uncertain what to do or lacks the internal or external resources to act exactly as he or she knows how to do. And this position saps energy, enthusiasm, and resolve. And there are short and long-term consequences for any of these positions and for the communities of which one is a member. This position can be a common one for social workers, therapists, and others interacting with people seeking asylum. And trying to move into position 1 can be empowering and helpful and energizing. I won't go into it, but in the paper that I've given at the end, the reference, Kate Weingarten talks about all these positions in relation to the George Floyd case, and I think it's a really helpful analogy description analogy that she makes. But thinking about it with the work with people seeking asylum, listening to a story and really listening, enabling someone to feel that someone is really hearing them and interested in them, is in itself a massive thing. People seeking asylum feel not believed, not listened to, and treated as criminals. So that in itself is an important position. And if you can convey that, it can help how you feel about it. And addressing their fears in small and concrete ways can help. Like an example, if someone is terrified that they will be deported any day and they're just living in total fear, it can make a difference to think with them practically. Would it be helpful to have a list of useful phone numbers, such as their solicitor, and give it to someone so that they know that they couldn't just disappear? I mean, actually thinking through with them what might make them feel a bit safer in an unsafe situation. Or helping someone find their voice. I recently saw a play in which 4 refugee women had been recruited to help inform midwives and health workers about their needs as asylum-seeking pregnant women. Just telling their story has been incredibly empowering for them, and it was difficult, but they've done it. But more than that, the staff have said how it changed their practice, how they learned so much from hearing the women themselves. And their play, which has now been recorded, will be used in training medical and nursing students. So it doesn't need to be big things. It can be small things that make life bearable. So what have you learned about yourself as a worker that you didn't know before through doing this kind of work? Does the work you do challenge your values and beliefs in a way that make it hard to continue, or can you find a way to bring them together, thinking about the witness positions above? And as Meep Geese, and I understand there's going to be there's a series about her just coming up, the woman who hid Anne Frank and her family from the Nazis for 2 years in Holland, said, even an ordinary secretary or housewife or teenager can turn on a small light in a dark room. And I thought that was what I wanted to end on. And that we've got a list of references, and the slides are going to be circulated later. So I won't go through those.
Hey, thanks, Julia. Good. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A, which we will try and do justice to in the 10 minutes we've got left. It's funny not being able to see you all, as Alison said, and just sort of know more about who you are and where you're coming from, and have all that nice toing and froing that you can have in person. But hey, here we are. I've got a list of questions, and I will trot through a few of them. People are asking about the slides and about sharing the recordings, and Son has answered that in the chat. I think they will be distributed in various ways, though I don't think you'll see the recording until the end of the seminar series. So first question, someone's asking about how, let me read it. How do you challenge the failure to provide NHS travel support? Locally, we're told quite clearly they know they should, but they don't have the money. Same for providing interpretation and travel to legal aid appointments. So I guess this is about what if, you know, despite all these things people are entitled to, service providers just say, no, can't have it, haven't got it. What do you think? What do you think, Alison?
I'm shocked.
Yeah. I think the legal aid appointments are outside what I know about, really, but with the NHS, I think having somebody who feels able to assert themselves in English and state that this is a right and it's contravening the Equality Act, etc., not to provide an interpreter, I think having been backed up by somebody like that is a first step. I think making a formal complaint, the person's up for that, but it's scary making a formal complaint when you worry about how that will affect your asylum claim.
But the worker, I mean, the worker can.
Yeah, without mentioning the person, maybe, but yeah.
I would see, maybe. Hey,
yeah.
you have to.
I'm thinking about the Doctors of the World cards that they have cards or leaflets that people can take to GPs with the stating the information that you're entitled to register without an address or without ID and so on. And maybe that is something to think about. Maybe there could be something people could take.
It still doesn't.
My entitlement, here's the reference, etc.
But it still doesn't work, though, even with the cards. I mean, some practices do. I really think you have to take it higher, and it has to be like not around an individual, but that, you know, this has got to be available. This is tiny amounts of money. This is not, you know, this is not going to bankrupt the NHS, even in its terrible state. You know, it's got to be fought for. This is so crucial.
The message is that someone just really has to be difficult here, and it's not down to the person themselves who will be feeling very vulnerable and dispossessed. They won't be able to do it. They need someone to advocate on their behalf and be difficult. And if it's more difficult for people to not pay the money than to pay it, then they'll probably pay it in the end. But it's one of those sort of sad processes of push and shove that have to take place.
We've got 5 minutes, so we better.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll move on.
I just see the comment in the chat about somebody who's done that, marched into hospital payment offices. Yeah,
made a real pest of myself. Exactly. Sometimes you've got to be, as they say, disagreeable. Okay, but I'm going to gather pace here. We're going to run on. I feel it very difficult to support people, in particular lone asylum seeking children, without getting involved emotionally. I know that I can't take the role of their auntie or big sister, but they need support to find themselves a new family here. Any tips to keep the limit between professional and friendly support? Basically, as Julia mentioned, is it okay to invite someone to our own house? Julia.
Well, I do think these things are about, this is where the supervision, the peer group, the talking with other people is absolutely essential. And I think it is very difficult when, you know, a lot of the people that we meet who are seeking asylum might be people that we'd like to be friends with or want to get to know, and how do you keep the boundary? I think some of it is about the awareness of, no, in this particular role I can't invite someone into my house. Maybe in a different role, if I'm not in a therapist role or a worker role, or get to know them in a different way, maybe it is. But
I think the important thing, as you mentioned, is about supervision, and about, if you are considering something like this, someone else in your team needs to know. You don't do it as a solitary act, and you certainly don't do it as an act of rebellion against the rules because you think it's really helpful. You have to have a network of support.
A place to think about it with other people.
Yeah, you have to think.
And especially this limits between professional and friendly support. I mean, I think people who are in this work, often it isn't about being detached as some other people might be. It's often the opposite, isn't it? And so you do want to be friendly, but it's really important to keep that boundary as a professional too. So yeah, I don't think it's an easy answer, but I think, yeah, talking with others helps.
Samia, you've asked us a lengthy and important question. I think it's beyond us to deal with it here. If you want to send us an email through our website, I think one of us could respond and just give you a bit of signposting as to where you might look and what you might think about. So please do that.
Yeah, maybe copy.
We're going to have to stop taking questions after.
Just the other one about the. Yeah. Oh, the next one about if people from asylum.
Yeah, let's just take that one. Yeah. What would your advice be to those providing support who come from asylum seeker and refugee backgrounds themselves? Julia.
I mean, I think resonances are going to be particularly common. It's going to be even harder to keep the boundaries, isn't it? And so the supervision and peer support, again, is absolutely crucial in those situations. But on the other hand, if you've got the same experience as somebody you're seeing, you can be really helpful. But it's how you manage that without getting too drawn in that you need to do the supervision, I think. Yes.
Boundaries. I'm sorry, because of boundaries, and we're going to finish at 7. We can't take any more questions because I've just got a little bit more to say. Share screen.
Maybe that's what you said, Chris. If anybody has any particular questions, they could send them through by email through the website.
Yeah. This is our book, Seeking Asylum and Mental Health, which we've just done our best to think about all these sorts of difficulties and problems and background and dilemmas. And we really struggled to make it readable rather than another dry academic text, which puts you to sleep as soon as you've started reading it. It's got a plot. It's got, we hope we gallop through everything in an interesting way. We've also got a website that supports the book. One of the things with a book is it gets out of date, particularly if you recommend resources and organizations. So we've tried to have a website that signposts you to a lot of current resources. You can browse it or you can look for something in particular. And if you've got questions, there may well be answers in some of the sections on this website. We're also always looking for resources to put on it and trying to update what we've got. So if there's anything you know about that we haven't included, please let us know. Again, send us an email through the website contact function. The thing is, it's an academic book and it's published by Cambridge University Press, and we know that it's very expensive. And not all of you working in this sector have got lots of spare money, and you're often doing what you're doing in a voluntary role. So we've arranged for some free copies for people on low incomes who are working in the sector. We've given some of these out, but we've still got quite a few left. So you can contact us and ask for one of these through the website. It's in the buy the book section. You'll see what we're asking you just to say about yourselves. It's not much. We do need an address, of course, if we're going to send you the book. So please remember to put that in. And last thing is a sort of plea, and that's my alarm saying we've come to time. If you'd like to read it and you like it, please post a review on Amazon or anywhere else you can, where other people will see it and you can spread the word, because we would like to get more people looking at it, because we put a lot of thought into it and we think it's really important sector for people to know things about. And we hope you enjoy it. We hope this has been useful. Thanks for coming tonight, and sorry we couldn't answer more of your questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.